When John and Emma approached their plot on the day of the competition, their hearts tightened with anticipation. The vegetables they had grown with such love and patience were their greatest achievements. But as they looked across the field, their eyes were immediately drawn to something standing before them. The massive vegetable of their neighbor, which clearly surpassed anything they had seen before. It wasn't just bigger, it was strangely perfect, as if nature itself had grown it. A chill ran down John's spine. This was something unimaginable. And then he noticed the neighbor's sly gaze on their plot. Questions began to rise, and what should have been a triumphant day turned into the beginning of something far more complicated. Chapter 1. A new day on the farm. The morning begins with animal care. The sun had barely crept over the horizon, casting a soft golden hue across the small town where John and Emma lived. It was another crisp morning, the kind that made you appreciate the warmth of a cup of tea and the stillness of the early hours. The air smelled of fresh grass, damp soil, and the faint scent of hay from the barn. John was already awake, his old bones creaking as he shuffled across the wooden floor of their modest farmhouse. He had always been an early riser. Emma, on the other hand, was a bit slower to greet the day. She had always been more of a night owl, but after years of living on the farm, she had grown accustomed to the early mornings too. By the time she joined John in the kitchen, he had already begun preparing the first round of tea. "Good morning, love," John said, his voice thick with sleep but warm and comforting as always. "Morning," Emma replied, giving him a soft smile as she took the cup from his hand. "Everything okay with the animals?" John nodded. "The chickens are fed, the ducks are waddling around, and the cows seem content. Just need to check on the pigs and the rabbits before breakfast." It was a routine they had followed for years. Their small farm, though not particularly large, kept them busy. They had pigs, geese, ducks, rabbits, and 2 cows. The animals were their lifeblood, their joy, and often, their frustration. But Emma and John took care of them like they were family. After finishing their tea, they bundled up against the cool morning air and stepped outside. The early light shimmered through the mist as they made their way to the barn. John's boots made a soft squelching sound on the wet ground, while Emma's more delicate steps were quieter, though equally determined. The pigs were first on the list. As John opened the gate, the squeals of excitement from the pigs greeted them. "Morning, you lot," he said, reaching into the trough and tossing in a handful of feed. The pigs quickly scrambled to devour it, their grunts filling the air. Emma smiled at the sight. "They always know when it's breakfast time, don't they? They never miss a meal," John chuckled, watching the pigs fight over the scraps. "We'll need to clean the pen later. It's a bit too messy in here." Emma nodded, though she was already thinking about the next task. The rabbits. The rabbits were, in some ways, more delicate than the pigs. Their needs were different, requiring a more careful touch. And lately, Emma had been noticing that one of the rabbits, a young buck, had been acting a little off. "Let's check on the rabbits next," Emma suggested, glancing toward the small hutch at the edge of the farm. John and Emma decide to enter the biggest vegetable contest. The rabbits were fine, though the young buck, as Emma had feared, seemed a little lethargic. She made a note to keep an eye on him. After finishing their rounds with the animals, they headed back to the house for breakfast, the warmth of the kitchen offering a welcome contrast to the cool morning air. John had a bowl of oatmeal, and Emma made a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs with herbs from their garden. The two of them ate in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's company. It was during a lull in their conversation that Emma suddenly spoke up. "You know, John," she began, looking out the window toward the garden, "I've been thinking, the town is holding that competition again, the biggest vegetable contest. What do you think?" John raised an eyebrow. "You mean the one they hold every summer?" "I don't know, Emma. I'm not sure we stand a chance." Emma smiled, her eyes sparkling with determination. "Why not? Our garden has never been in better shape. We've got those huge zucchinis coming in, and the pumpkins are growing like crazy. I think we could win this year." John considered her words for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know. It's a lot of work. The competition is fierce, and we've never entered before. But Emma wasn't easily dissuaded. We've got the time and we've got the skill. We've been farming for decades. What do we have to lose? John laughed. All right. I suppose it could be fun. But if we're doing this, we need to get serious about it. Emma beamed. Exactly. Let's go out and take a look at the garden after breakfast. We need to pick the right vegetables. First harvest, the feel of hard work. The rest of the morning was spent working in the garden. The soil was rich and dark, the fruits of their labor already showing. The squash and zucchini plants had exploded with life, their large, green leaves providing shade for the long, crooked vegetables. The pumpkins were the size of beach balls now, their vibrant orange skins gleaming in the sunlight. John and Emma carefully selected the largest zucchini, examining it from every angle. It had the shape and the heft they were looking for, though they knew they would need to nurture it a little longer before they could declare it the winner. They both stood there, taking in the sight of their hard work. The sun was high in the sky now, casting a warm glow over the land. The sweat on their brows didn't seem to bother them. They were used to it. It was the satisfaction of seeing the fruits of their labor, the product of months of planning, planting, and tending, that made it all worthwhile. This one, John said, pointing to the zucchini. This could be the one. Emma grinned. We'll have to take good care of it. Make sure it's perfect for the contest. It was an exciting thought, an adventure they hadn't had in a long time, preparing the plot for the contest. Later that afternoon, John and Emma set to work clearing a special plot of land for their competition entry. They needed a space that would be free of any disturbances, a place where their prized zucchini and pumpkins could grow without interference. John brought out the old hoe, digging into the earth with a precision that came from years of experience. Emma followed behind him, adding compost and adjusting the soil's texture. Together, they worked in harmony, their movements a dance of decades of shared routines. We'll need to keep an eye on this spot, Emma said, wiping sweat from her brow. No animals sneaking in here, and we'll have to water it more than the rest. John nodded. I'll set up the irrigation system tonight. It'll keep the soil nice and moist. Once the plot was ready, they carefully moved the vegetables into place. It wasn't just about putting the plants in the ground. It was about creating the perfect environment for them to thrive. And for John and Emma, the effort was worth it. Rabbit trouble, unusual behavior. As they worked, however, something in the rabbit hutch caught Emma's eye. The young buck was still acting strange, its behavior more erratic than before. It was pacing back and forth, its fur matted with something dark. Emma's heart sank. She had a bad feeling about it. John, she called, her voice tense. Something's wrong with the buck. John hurried over, wiping his hands on his pants. What's going on? Emma reached into the hutch, trying to calm the rabbit, but it pulled away from her, its eyes wide and frightened. I'm not sure, Emma said, feeling the animal's trembling body. It's like he's scared of something. John squatted down next to her, inspecting the rabbit carefully. It could be a disease or maybe something spooked him. We need to get him checked out, Emma. Fast. Emma nodded, her worry deepening. This wasn't just a simple issue, it was something more, something that could threaten the delicate balance of their farm. The day was starting to take on a different tone, one of uncertainty and concern. They carefully placed the rabbit back in its hutch and locked the door. But the nagging feeling that something was wrong stayed with them. The peaceful, sunny morning had turned into something more ominous, and they both knew that they needed to stay alert. There were bigger challenges ahead than a vegetable contest. And as Emma and John stood there, looking over their farm, it was clear that this day would not be as simple as they had hoped. Chapter 2. Uncovering the Losses. The sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows over the farm as the day unfolded. John and Emma had already spent the early morning attending to the animals, their familiar routine helping to settle their minds after the excitement of preparing for the competition. But even as they moved through their morning chores, a sense of unease began to creep in. It was during the second round of animal care that Emma first noticed something was wrong. She had always been attuned to the smallest changes on the farm, whether it was a slight change in an animal's behavior or the way the wind shifted in the trees. That morning, however, something felt different. The air was thick with a sense of impending trouble. As they approached the garden, John noticed her pause. She was looking at the plot they had set aside for their competition entry, the one that contained the prized zucchini and pumpkins. "Something's off," Emma muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the area. John followed her gaze and immediately felt a tightening in his chest. The large zucchini, which had been thriving the day before, looked different, smaller. There was no denying it. "Emma," John said, his voice tense, "do you see what I see?" Emma nodded slowly, her heart sinking. The zucchini they had been counting on for the contest seemed to have shrunk overnight. The once firm, bright green vegetable had softened, and its skin was starting to wrinkle. "What in the world happened?" Emma whispered, kneeling down to examine it. She gently touched the zucchini, her fingers brushing the uneven surface. There was no visible damage, no sign of disease, yet it was as if it had withered before their eyes. John let out a frustrated sigh, standing up and surveying the garden. It wasn't just the zucchini that had been affected. The pumpkins, too, seemed smaller than they had been just the day before. The leaves of the plants appeared crumpled, and the once vibrant orange fruits now looked dull and unripe. "What do you think?" Emma asked, looking at him for answers. "Is it the weather? Did we do something wrong?" John shook his head. "I don't think so. The weather's been fine. We've been watering them properly. Something's off." They spent the next hour checking every inch of the garden, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The more they searched, the more unsettling it became. The zucchini and pumpkins that had once promised to be their best crop ever were now almost unrecognizable. It was as though something had drained the life out of them overnight. As they stood there in silence, the wind rustling the leaves around them, the truth slowly began to dawn on John. This wasn't a case of bad weather, nor was it the plant's fault. No, someone or something had tampered with their crop. Emma's face was pale as she turned to him. "John, do you think?" John didn't need her to finish the sentence. He had already begun to consider the possibility. "We need to investigate," he said quietly, his voice tight with frustration. "Someone's been in here, and they've stolen our vegetables. They've taken our prize." Emma's heart skipped a beat at the realization. The peaceful, idyllic morning had shifted into something much darker. Their hard work, their hopes for the contest, had been shattered in an instant. The theft wasn't just a blow to their pride. It was an attack on everything they had worked for. The hours spent nurturing those plants, the effort to make sure every detail was perfect. It all seemed meaningless now. "We need to figure out who did this," John continued, his jaw set in determination. "And we need to stop them before they do it again." Emma nodded, her thoughts racing. But before she could speak, John turned and began heading back toward the barn, his mind already shifting gears. As they walked, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The animals had been their focus all morning, and now, as they moved between the pens and cages, she realized that the animals themselves seemed a little more restless than usual. The ducks were honking loudly, the chickens were clucking anxiously, and even the cows seemed agitated. "It's like they know something's going on," Emma muttered, her eyes scanning the fields around them. John glanced at her, noticing the worry etched on her face. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Emma, but we have to be careful. Whoever did this, they might try to strike again." Emma didn't respond. Instead, she continued walking, her mind racing with possible scenarios. The farm was small, and it was a close-knit community. She couldn't fathom who would do something like this, but someone had taken their vegetables and they had to find out who and why. The mood on the farm had changed drastically by mid-morning. John and Emma had completed their usual rounds, but their minds were clouded by the theft. The joy they had felt the day before had been replaced with a heavy sense of suspicion and worry. As the hours passed, Emma couldn't help but feel more and more unsettled. Something was wrong, but the pieces just didn't seem to fit together. Who would steal a couple of pumpkins and zucchinis from their small farm? The idea of theft on their property was almost unthinkable, yet the evidence was undeniable. The plants had been sabotaged. John was equally concerned, though his mind was already working on the next steps. He knew that their farm, though modest, was a valuable asset. The land was fertile, and their livestock had always been well cared for. If someone had stolen their crop, they likely saw it as an opportunity for easy gain. But who would it be? As the afternoon wore on, John found himself looking over their neighbors with new eyes. He had always trusted the people in their small town, but now he was beginning to question everything. Had one of them taken advantage of their hard work? John's gaze lingered on the property across the road, Hank and Margaret's farm. Hank had always been a bit too eager to offer advice on how to run a farm, and John couldn't help but think that maybe the man had been watching them too closely. It wouldn't be the first time a neighbor had tried to get ahead by taking advantage of someone else's work. "I don't know, Emma," John muttered as he sat down on the porch, his eyes never leaving Hank's property. "I think we need to keep an eye on him." Emma looked at him, concern written all over her face. "You think Hank did this?" "I don't know for sure," John replied, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "But I'm not ruling it out. We need to be careful. Whoever did this will do it again if we're not vigilant." Emma sat beside him, her mind racing with possibilities. She had always trusted their neighbors, but now she wasn't so sure. The idea of someone betraying them so casually, stealing their crops right out from under them, was almost too much to bear. "I think we should set up some kind of watch tonight," Emma suggested, her voice low. "If someone's been coming onto the property at night, we need to catch them in the act." John looked at her, impressed by her resolve. "You're right. We'll set up a watch tonight, and we'll be ready for anything." That evening, as the sky darkened and the air grew cool, John and Emma prepared for their first night of vigilance. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they couldn't let this theft go unanswered. They had worked too hard, and their farm meant too much to them to let someone take it all away. As they settled into position, hidden among the shadows of their barn, John couldn't help but wonder what the night would bring. Would they catch the thief? Or was this just the beginning of something even more troubling? The stakes were high, and they both knew that their small farm was about to face a much larger challenge than they had ever anticipated. Chapter 3. The first steps toward unraveling the mystery. The night air was cool and thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind whispered through the trees. John and Emma stood together in the shadows near the barn, their eyes scanning the darkened fields around them. This was their first night on watch, and the weight of their responsibility hung heavily on their shoulders. John had prepared for this moment with the quiet precision of a man who had spent a lifetime managing his farm. The lanterns were dimly lit, casting long shadows over the rows of crops, but the real strategy lay in what they could not see, keeping their presence undetected, hidden in the very darkness they sought to understand. Emma stood beside him, her arms crossed against the chill, her mind racing with worry. "Do you think we'll catch them tonight?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. John shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the garden. "I don't know, Emma, but we need to be ready for anything. Whoever's doing this isn't going to stop just because we're watching." Emma nodded, though the uncertainty in her heart was hard to shake. The thought that anyone, might be stealing from them, violating the very sanctuary they'd built with years of hard work, was nearly unbearable. The nights felt lonelier now, with every creak of the barn door or snap of a twig making their hearts race. The hours dragged on in the quiet night, punctuated by the sounds of nature. Emma's eyelids grew heavy, but she fought against sleep, knowing that if they missed this opportunity, it might be too late. John, too, remained vigilant, though his mind was occupied with something else entirely. "I'm worried," he finally admitted, his voice low and rough in the silence. "I can't shake the feeling that someone close to us is involved. I've been thinking about Hank, from across the way. He's been acting strange lately." Emma turned to him, startled. "What do you mean? You think Hank's been behind it all?" John hesitated before answering, his eyes narrowing as he watched the distant outline of Hank's farm. "I don't know. But I don't trust him anymore. He's been asking a lot of questions about our crops, about how we're doing things. It's almost like he's been trying to figure out how to get ahead of us. Emma chewed on her lower lip, considering his words. Do you think he'd go as far as to steal from us? John's expression was grim. I wouldn't put it past him, but it could be someone else. I just have a feeling. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them, and both of them stiffened. For a moment, they thought they heard something, a distant crunch of footsteps across the field. But the sound faded, and silence returned, even heavier than before. Hours passed, but nothing changed. The thief, whoever they were, did not appear that night. As the sky lightened with the first hints of dawn, John and Emma finally returned to the house, both of them exhausted but unwilling to let their guard down. They knew this was just the beginning. The following morning, they began their usual rounds, tending to the animals and checking on the garden, though the nagging worry hung over them like a cloud. As they walked toward the vegetable plot, the scene before them only heightened their growing concern. Emma stopped dead in her tracks. John, look. The garden looked worse than it had the night before. The zucchini plants, once robust and full of promise, now appeared even more withered, their leaves curling in on themselves. The pumpkins, too, were smaller, and the once vibrant orange fruits were now faint, almost sickly in appearance. But it wasn't just the crops that had suffered. On closer inspection, they could see clear signs of disturbance. Footprints, deep, heavy ones, marred the soft earth of their garden, leading toward the damaged plants. Emma crouched down, her eyes scanning the ground. These aren't animal tracks, she said slowly, tracing the edges of the marks with her finger. Someone's been walking here, deliberately. John's face hardened, and he followed her gaze. Someone's been back. Emma's heart sank. The thought that they might have a repeat thief was bad enough, but the idea that the person had been back for a second round made her stomach churn. They had been so careful in their watch, and yet the damage was still done. I don't understand, Emma murmured, frustration clouding her voice. Why would they come back? Didn't they get enough from last night? John, deep in thought, shook his head. It doesn't make sense, but it's obvious someone knows exactly what they're doing. They must be watching us. They spent the next few hours inspecting the entire garden, but there were no more signs of the thief. Everything else seemed untouched, though the heavy feeling of violation lingered in the air. It was as if the culprit was taunting them, moving in the shadows, always just out of reach. John's suspicion about Hank lingered in the back of his mind, though he didn't voice it again to Emma. Instead, they focused on what they could do now, on how to catch the thief in the act. By midday, their patience was wearing thin. The sense of helplessness had begun to settle into their bones, the weight of unanswered questions making everything feel heavier. They hadn't caught the thief yet, but they weren't about to give up. It was then, as they stood there, looking at the empty space where the zucchinis had once thrived, that a new, unsettling thought crept into Emma's mind. What if it's not Hank? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if it's someone else? John turned to her, his brow furrowed. Who else would it be? She shrugged, uncertainty in her eyes. I don't know. Maybe someone who's been watching us from the edges of the town. Someone who knows when we're vulnerable. John's gaze hardened. If that's the case, then we'll have to be even more careful. We'll have to set a trap. As they stood there, contemplating their next move, they heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching from the direction of the town. A car slowed and then stopped just down the road. John and Emma exchanged uneasy glances. Emma could make out a familiar figure standing by the vehicle, someone who shouldn't be here. It was Margaret, Hank's wife. She was standing by the car, looking out toward the farm, her eyes scanning the horizon. Something in her posture felt wrong, like she was waiting for something or someone. John felt his suspicions rise once more. Margaret had been quiet, too quiet, the past few days. But the way she was standing there, looking so out of place, it didn't sit well with him. What do you think she's doing here? Emma asked softly. John didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply stood there, watching her, his mind working at full speed. I don't know, he replied slowly. But I have a feeling we're about to find out. Chapter 4. Life on the Edge. The days had begun to stretch on endlessly, each one blending into the next with the same worries, the same fears. Emma couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in her chest since the theft of their crops. It wasn't just the stolen vegetables that bothered her. It was everything else. The animals, the farm, their way of life, all felt more fragile than it ever had before. That morning, as she approached the rabbit pen to check on the animals, she noticed something unusual. The usual liveliness of the rabbits, darting in and out of their small wooden shelters, was missing. Instead, the rabbits were huddled together, their eyes wide and fearful, twitching nervously at every small sound. Emma's heart sank. "John, come here," she called quietly, her voice trembling slightly with concern. John, who had been busy inspecting the far end of the property, made his way over to the pen. He took one look at the rabbits and frowned. "They don't look right," he said, his voice low. "They've been acting like this all morning?" Emma nodded, her fingers lightly brushing the wire of the pen. "It's like they're scared of something or someone." John crouched down beside her, his hands resting on the edge of the pen. "Maybe it's just the stress from the theft. Animals can pick up on things we don't even notice, but we'll need to keep a close eye on them." Emma agreed, though a small voice inside her kept whispering that it wasn't just the theft. Something was off. As the morning wore on, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the rabbits. They had always been so full of energy, playful and curious, but now they were withdrawn, huddled in the corners of their pen. The only thing that had changed recently was the increased tension on the farm. The theft, the mystery surrounding the stolen crops, and the darkening atmosphere that seemed to hang over everything. Later that day, Emma took it upon herself to observe the other animals more carefully. The chickens were more restless than usual, their clucking frantic as they pecked around the barnyard. The ducks, too, seemed agitated, their usual calm demeanor replaced with uneasy pacing. Even the cows, who were usually the calmest of all, had their heads low, their eyes darting nervously toward the edges of the pasture. It was clear to Emma that the animals were feeling the strain. Something in the air had changed, and they were responding to it in their own way. But what could it be? After spending a few more hours observing them, she realized something. The animals were acting as if they were anticipating danger. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, instinctual sense that something wasn't right. Emma thought back to the advice she had received when she first started working with animals. When they behaved unusually, it usually meant something was coming, something they were preparing for. She quickly made her way to John, who was in the barn, checking on the feed. "John," she said urgently, "I think the animals are trying to tell us something. We need to make some changes, start using a new method of care." John looked up at her, surprised by the intensity in her voice. "What are you talking about?" Emma took a deep breath. "I think we need to be more proactive. If they're sensing something, we need to protect them, protect ourselves. Maybe we need to keep them in more secure areas at night, maybe even treat them like they're in danger." John frowned, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're worried they're sensing the thief?" Emma nodded. "Not just the thief. I think whatever's been going on here, it's something bigger. I don't know why, but I feel like it's only going to get worse." John considered her words for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's get the animals into more secure spaces tonight. If this is something bigger than we realize, we need to be ready for whatever comes next." The evening passed in an uneasy silence. John and Emma worked together to make sure the animals were safe and contained, doubling the security on the pens and stables. They even set up additional lights around the perimeter of the farm to make sure nothing could sneak up on them in the dark. As the night crept closer, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The stolen crops, the strange behavior of the animals, and the mounting tension between them and their neighbors were all coming together in a way she couldn't quite understand. It was like they were on the edge of something dangerous, and there was no turning back now. John, however, had a different focus. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the farm, he decided it was time to take further action. He had spent the last few days mulling over the idea of setting up traps in the field. After all, if someone was stealing from them, they couldn't just wait around for it to happen again. They needed to take control of the situation. By the time the evening settled in, John had placed several traps around the garden, the very garden where their prized vegetables had been taken. They were simple devices, designed to catch someone who was too careless. But John wasn't fooling himself. The traps weren't just for protection. They were a message that they weren't going to stand by and let their livelihood be taken without a fight. Emma watched him from the porch, her mind filled with doubts. "You think these will stop whoever's been stealing from us?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. John didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to her, his face shadowed in the dim light of the evening. "I don't know, Emma, but I can't just sit here and let them take everything we've worked for." A heavy silence settled between them. The weight of their decision hung in the air, each of them wondering what the future would bring. As they prepared to settle in for the night, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees and sending a chill down their spines. Emma stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the fields. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as she was about to turn back inside, she heard a rustle in the distance. Too close, too deliberate to be the wind. "John," she whispered urgently, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" John was already standing, his hand reaching for the lantern. "Stay here, Emma. I'll check it out." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Be careful." John nodded, stepping out into the dark, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Emma stood frozen, waiting, her mind spinning with possibilities. Had someone triggered the traps? Was it the thief? Or was something else happening? Just as she was about to call out to him, she heard footsteps approaching, quick, deliberate steps. But they weren't John's. She turned, her breath catching as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, tall and shadowed, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Emma's heart pounded as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Before she could speak, the man spoke first. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice low and steady. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was exactly what was about to come. Chapter 5: Night Trials. The air had grown heavy with the promise of a long, sleepless night. The farm was quieter than usual, unnervingly so. As Emma and John stood on the porch, gazing out at the fields, the weight of their decision to stay the night in the open seemed to settle in. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow across the farm, and the wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been feeling an unease deep in her stomach, the kind of feeling that made her question whether they were prepared for what they were about to face. John, his face lined with worry but determination, nodded. "We have to. If someone's been stealing from us, we can't just sit back and wait. We need to see it for ourselves." They had spent the entire afternoon preparing for the night ahead, double-checking the traps, securing the barn, and ensuring the animals were all safely locked away. But there was something about the darkness that made everything feel more fragile. Emma had been hesitant to leave the animals in the barn overnight, but John had assured her that this was their best chance to catch the thief. They both knew that staying out in the open wasn't ideal. There were no guarantees that they would even see the thief, let alone catch them. But it was the only option they had left. As they made their way to the field, Emma felt her heart rate pick up. She wasn't sure if it was the tension of the situation or the sheer unknown of what the night held, but her pulse was racing. The field was silent, save for the distant rustle of leaves in the trees and the occasional chirp of a lone cricket. The garden, with its now half-empty rows, seemed even more vulnerable in the moonlight. The vegetables that had once been so promising, so full of potential, now lay exposed to whatever or whoever was out there. John took a deep breath, his voice steady as he spoke. "Let's sit here, behind these bushes. We'll have a good view of the traps, and we'll be able to hear anything that moves in the field." Emma nodded silently, trying to steady her nerves. They settled down in the long grass, the cool earth beneath them providing little comfort. The smell of damp soil and the hum of the night filled the air, but beneath it all, there was a sense of foreboding. Every sound, every movement, seemed amplified in the stillness. They waited in silence, their eyes scanning the dark expanse of the field. Time seemed to stretch on forever, each minute passing like an hour. Emma tried to distract herself by focusing on the comforting thought that at least they were doing something. They were taking control, protecting their home, and that was all they could do. Suddenly, a noise broke through the stillness, soft at first, but growing louder. Emma tensed, her breath catching in her throat. It was coming from the direction of the bushes near the traps. "John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you hear that?" John held his finger to his lips, signaling for her to remain silent. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something was moving in the underbrush, just on the other side of the garden. The noise grew louder, and Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Was it the thief, or was it something else entirely? She fought to keep her breathing steady, trying not to make a sound. The rustling continued, growing closer, until Emma could make out the shape of a figure moving through the dark. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it the thief, or perhaps someone else who knew they were watching? Then, there was a snap, a sudden, loud crack of a twig breaking underfoot. Without warning, the trap near the garden sprung. The metal jaws clamped shut with a resounding click, and Emma's pulse surged in her ears. She held her breath, waiting, praying that it was the thief, that they had finally caught the culprit. John jumped to his feet, grabbing the lantern. He moved quickly, his steps sure but quiet, and Emma followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The rustling had stopped, and now all was eerily silent. They reached the trap, the lantern light flickering as John bent down to inspect it. "What do you see?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. John hesitated for a moment, then shook his head, frustration written across his face. "Nothing. There's nothing in the trap." Emma stared at the empty trap, her stomach sinking. Then what was that noise? Who was in the field? John stood up slowly, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but we're not alone." Before Emma could respond, there was another sound, a faint scuffling, followed by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the ground. It was coming from the opposite side of the field, near the edge where the garden met the forest. "Stay here," John said urgently, grabbing her arm. "I'm going to check it out. If someone's out there, we can't let them get away." Emma wanted to protest, to insist that they stay together, but the look in John's eyes told her he was already committed to going alone. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Be careful." John moved swiftly, crouching low as he made his way toward the noise. Emma watched from her position behind the bushes, her eyes straining to follow his movements in the dark. Every nerve in her body was on high alert as she waited for the sound of footsteps or voices. But all she could hear was the faint rustling of the wind in the trees, and her own breath, heavy with anticipation. Then, suddenly, a figure appeared out of the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dragging something heavy behind him. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The figure stopped momentarily, looking over his shoulder as if sensing he wasn't alone. Emma froze, holding her breath, hoping he hadn't noticed her or John. But it was too late. The man turned, his eyes locking with hers. A brief moment of recognition passed between them, a moment of understanding, as if they both realized that the game was up. He dropped what he was carrying, a sack filled with vegetables, and began to back away slowly, his hands raised in surrender. John appeared out of nowhere, moving quickly to intercept him. "Stop right there," he shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. The man froze, his eyes darting between John and Emma. "I didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice trembling. "I was just trying to feed my family." John didn't lower his guard. "Who are you? And why have you been stealing from us?" The man swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth had finally caught up with him. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to turn to," My family. We've been struggling, and when I saw how much you had in your garden, I thought I could take just a little, just enough to get by. Emma's heart went out to him, but she couldn't ignore the fact that he had taken what wasn't his. You shouldn't have taken it, she said quietly. But we understand. We know what it's like to struggle. The man nodded, his eyes downcast. I never meant to cause any trouble. I just didn't know what else to do. John stepped forward, lowering the lantern as he sighed. We'll take you to town. You can explain yourself to the authorities. But next time, you'd better ask for help, instead of taking from others. The man nodded again, his face full of regret. Thank you. I won't do it again. As the night continued to unfold, Emma felt a strange sense of relief. The thief was caught, the mystery was solved, and though it hadn't been an easy night, they had come through it together. The farm, despite everything, was safe again. Chapter 6. The Discovery of the Truth. The light of dawn crept slowly across the field, painting the landscape in soft shades of gold and orange. After the tension of the previous night, the morning felt almost surreal, like a calm after a storm. The events of the night were still fresh in Emma's mind as she stood beside John, watching the sky brighten. The stolen vegetables were returned, and the thief had confessed, but there was still a sense of unease lingering in the air. John, Emma began, her voice hesitant. Do you think we really know everything now? John turned to her, his face tired but resolute. We know more than we did before, that's for sure. But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story. His words echoed in Emma's mind, the doubts starting to grow. While the man had confessed, something about the situation didn't sit right. How had he known exactly when and where to strike? Had he been watching them for longer than they realized? As they prepared to head to town to report the incident, a knock at the door interrupted their thoughts. They exchanged a glance, both uneasy about who might be calling at this hour. John opened the door slowly, revealing their neighbor, Mr. Thompson, standing on the porch, his face tight with concern. Morning, John, Emma. Mr. Thompson greeted them, though his usual warmth was absent. I've heard what happened last night. Mind if I have a word? John stepped aside, motioning for Mr. Thompson to come in. Emma, now standing in the doorway, could sense that something was off. The neighbor's expression was too guarded, too stiff for a casual visit. Once inside, Mr. Thompson didn't waste any time. I don't know how to put this, but I think you should know. I think I may have been wrong about something. Emma frowned, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Well, Mr. Thompson began, his gaze shifting uneasily from one of them to the other. I was the one who told the thief about your vegetables. John and Emma froze. The air in the room seemed to thin, the shock of Mr. Thompson's words hitting them like a physical blow. They had trusted him as a friend and neighbor. Now, this revelation was like a slap in the face. You, John began, his voice tight with disbelief. You told him? But why? Mr. Thompson looked guilty, his eyes avoiding theirs. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I didn't think he'd actually steal from you. I thought he was just looking for some extra food for his family. It was a mistake. A cold silence hung between them. Emma could feel the tension in her chest, the betrayal cutting deeper than she could have imagined. They had worked so hard to build their farm, and now their neighbor had been the one to set it all in motion. You knew he was struggling, but you didn't think about the consequences? Emma's voice cracked, a mix of hurt and anger filling her words. Mr. Thompson nodded, shame written all over his face. I never meant for any of this to happen. It was just, I thought I was helping, and I didn't think through how it would affect you too. John stepped forward, his expression stern. You could have come to us, asked for help, but instead, you betrayed our trust. Do you realize how much damage this has caused? I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for it to get this far. Emma crossed her arms, struggling to keep her emotions in check. The hurt, the confusion. It all mixed together, threatening to overwhelm her. She looked at John, silently asking him what to do. He met her gaze, and after a long pause, he spoke. Mr. Thompson, I don't know how to process this, he said slowly. We've worked hard to build our farm, and we've always tried to help others when we could. But you've put us in a difficult position. Emma nodded. You've caused us a lot of pain, and it's going to take time to rebuild the trust that's been broken. I understand, Mr. Thompson replied quietly, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. The room was heavy with unspoken words, the weight of the situation settling on all of them. But as the minutes stretched into a painful silence, Emma realized that, for the first time in a long while, the trust she had once placed in their neighbor was gone. Could they ever repair the damage that had been done? Later that day, as they returned to their farm, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The stolen vegetables had been recovered, but the wound caused by the betrayal would take longer to heal. They needed time to process everything and figure out what the next step would be. But for now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the night took over, John and Emma found solace in the quiet of their farm. The animals were safe again, and the fields, though slightly bruised, would continue to grow. They had weathered the storm, and as they sat together, side by side, Emma felt a small flicker of peace return to her heart. They couldn't change what had happened, but they could control what came next. Later that evening, as John and Emma went about their routine, the farm felt different, changed in a way neither of them could fully describe. It was as if the shadows of the night had deepened, but there was also a lightness, an awareness, that they would have to keep their eyes wide open from now on. The truth had come to light in the most unexpected way, but it had left them with a sense of clarity. They weren't alone. They had each other, and that was enough. The next morning, life on the farm would continue, but things would never be quite the same. And yet, as Emma gazed out at the field, she knew that, despite the setbacks, despite the challenges ahead, their farm would endure. It was theirs, and no one could take that away. A new chapter was beginning, one filled with the promise of change, growth, and a renewed sense of hope. It wasn't just about the vegetables or the animals. It was about their resilience, their ability to stand together in the face of adversity. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Emma felt ready to face whatever came next. And as she closed her eyes, the soft breeze carrying the scent of the earth, she knew that the farm would continue to thrive in its own way, no matter what. Chapter 7, The Turning Point. The morning sun was relentless, casting long shadows over the farm as John and Emma worked together, moving methodically through the fields. The stolen harvest had returned, but the damage had already been done. The vegetables, though still growing, seemed less vibrant, their leaves less lush. There was an undeniable tension in the air, and with the competition looming ever closer, John and Emma knew they had little time to regain the ground they had lost. The farm was alive with activity. The animals still needed their care, the crops still had to be tended, and despite the mounting pressure, the couple worked with a focused determination. John, we need to do everything we can to help these plants grow. The competition's just days away, and we can't afford to fall behind, Emma said, wiping sweat from her brow as she surveyed the patch of carrots. I know, Emma, I know, John replied, squatting down beside the vegetables, gently inspecting them. I've been thinking, we need to go back to the basics. We've been trying too much new stuff, but sometimes the old ways are best. Emma frowned. Old ways? Do you mean how we did things back when we first started? I thought we needed more modern solutions. I'm not saying we abandon everything, John said with a small smile, but there's something about the old methods that I can't shake. Remember the way your father used to nurture his plants? The hand-tilled soil, the careful observation of each leaf. Maybe that's what we've missed. It had been years since Emma's father had passed, and she hadn't realized how much of his wisdom she had let slip into the background. His old techniques were often slow, tedious, but undeniably effective. The memory of how he would patiently walk the fields, assessing each plant, checking for signs of trouble, flooded her mind. You know, you might be right, she said softly. Maybe we've been too focused on the quick fixes. The next several hours were spent in what felt like a new rhythm. John took his old gardening tools from the shed, the ones that had been gathering dust for years, and set to work, tilling the soil with care. Emma followed suit, pulling weeds by hand, making sure to not disturb the roots of the growing vegetables. Felt good, familiar, and grounding. The old methods weren't quick, but they gave the plants the attention they needed. And soon, John and Emma could see the first signs of change. The vegetables were brightening, their leaves unfurling as if they were reaching out for the sunlight. While John and Emma focused on their work, their thoughts often returned to the animals. With everything going on, they had neglected their usual routines. But as Emma walked towards the barn, she noticed a slight change in the atmosphere. Something felt different, more peaceful, almost as if the animals themselves were feeling the shift in the air. In the barn, the animals greeted Emma with their usual chorus of sounds. The pigs snorted, the ducks quacked loudly, and the cows mooed from their stall. But it was the rabbits that caught Emma's attention, especially the ones that had caused so much trouble before. They were calm, almost unusually so. The bunnies had stopped acting up, no longer chewing on the fences or attempting to escape. Emma felt a sense of relief as she watched them hop peacefully in their pens. Perhaps all the added stress had affected not just their crops but also their animals. Now, with more attention being given to the farm as a whole, the animals seemed to calm down. John came to join Emma in the barn, and together, they worked to clean and feed the animals. Maybe this is what we've been missing, he mused. Balance, taking care of everything, not just one thing at a time. As the day wore on, their sense of hope grew. The harvest wasn't perfect, but it was better than before, and with a few more days of care, they knew they could do something extraordinary. The animals were well fed, the crops were thriving, and most importantly, John and Emma had rediscovered a deeper sense of purpose in their work. That night, as they prepared for the competition, a strange feeling hung in the air. They were used to the quiet rhythm of life on the farm, and the upcoming contest had felt like just another hurdle to cross. But now, as they sat down for their evening meal, they knew that this contest would be different. It wasn't just about winning, it was about proving something to themselves. What if we don't win? Emma asked quietly, her voice betraying a hint of doubt. John looked up from his plate, meeting her gaze. Then we don't. But that doesn't change the work we've done here. Look at our farm, Emma. Look at what we've achieved despite everything. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. You're right. We've come this far together. Whether we win or not, this farm is ours, and that's what matters. The next morning, Emma awoke to the sounds of birds chirping outside their window. It was the day of the competition, the day that would test not only the fruits of their labor but the strength of their resilience. With their hearts full of hope, they walked to the field where their vegetables were carefully arranged. John and Emma had put everything into making their patch look its best, paying attention to every detail. But there was an air of calmness that surrounded them, a sense that, no matter the outcome, they had given everything they had. The competition grounds were bustling with activity, filled with farmers and families from all over. The judges walked past the rows of vegetables, inspecting the crops with great care. When they stopped in front of John and Emma's patch, Emma felt her pulse quicken. Would they be recognized for their hard work? The judges' eyes scanned the vegetables, lingering for a moment on the towering carrots and the plump tomatoes. Then one of the judges smiled and nodded. Impressive, he said. These are some of the healthiest and most well-maintained vegetables we've seen today. John and Emma exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride. But before they could bask in the praise, the next competitors' crops were examined. The judging process continued, and the tension seemed to grow with each passing minute. Are we going to win? Emma whispered. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just squeezed her hand, smiling in that quiet way that always made her feel at ease. We've already won, Emma, no matter what happens next. And so, as the day continued, they waited, together, side by side, knowing that no matter the result, they had already triumphed in the ways that truly mattered. But as the judges continued their rounds, one thing was certain. Their hard work had paid off in ways they hadn't expected. They may not have been able to control everything, but they had found something much more valuable than any trophy. They had found peace in the process. Chapter 8. The Contest, the Battle for First Place. The sun barely peeked over the horizon as John and Emma awoke that morning. The day they had been preparing for had finally arrived, the annual competition for the biggest and best vegetables. Their minds raced with excitement and anxiety. Every moment, every decision had led them to this day. All the work, the long hours, and the setbacks, all had culminated in this one final chance to prove themselves. As Emma stepped out of the house, she breathed in the cool morning air, savoring the freshness of the farm. The usual routine of feeding the animals felt strangely rushed today. Her heart beat a little faster than usual, and her thoughts were consumed with the contest. Would their vegetables be judged worthy? Could they overcome the challenge of competitors who had been preparing for months, some even years? She turned to John, who was feeding the pigs, his usual calm demeanor unchanged. "John, what if we don't win?" Emma asked, voice trembling ever so slightly as she adjusted the collar of her jacket. John smiled, a reassuring glint in his eye. "It's not about winning, Emma. It's about showing what we can do, about how far we've come. We've worked hard, and that's what counts." But even his words didn't completely calm Emma's nerves. It wasn't just the competition that worried her. It was the idea of standing before a crowd, being judged, not just for the vegetables but for everything they had worked for. The prize was one thing, but the respect from their peers, the recognition for their effort, that was something else entirely. By the time the sun had climbed higher in the sky, John and Emma had finished their morning chores. The animals had been fed, the barn cleaned, and the vegetable patch tended to. Yet the biggest task lay ahead. The vegetables had to be perfect. John meticulously arranged the carrots, carefully brushing off any dirt, ensuring that each root was aligned with precision. Emma tended to the tomatoes, plucking off any imperfections and wiping them down with a cloth. As they worked side by side, their thoughts were intertwined with the preparation. The competition was fierce, but they knew they had done everything they could. Their patch was as good as it would ever be. They were ready. Still, as they approached the competition grounds, a wave of unease washed over Emma. The fairgrounds were bustling with activity. Farmers from neighboring towns had arrived, their booths set up with care. The air was thick with excitement, but also with a sense of tension. This wasn't just any contest. It was the one they had been working toward all year. Emma's fingers tightened around the straps of her basket as they approached the judging area. The judges were already making their rounds, inspecting the vegetables with intense scrutiny. A few other competitors had already set up their booths, displaying massive pumpkins, enormous zucchinis, and perfectly symmetrical carrots. The competition was fierce, and Emma could see the pride in the eyes of the other farmers. They had come prepared just like John and Emma. But it was the next booth over that caught her attention. A tall, older man with a stern face was unloading his vegetables. His booth was practically perfect, each vegetable placed with meticulous care. His display was impressive, to say the least. Emma's stomach sank. He had been a formidable competitor for years, and his crops had always been the gold standard. She had watched him win year after year, and his reputation was nearly unbeatable. "Isn't that Mr. Dawkins?" Emma asked John, her voice trembling. John glanced over at the man. "Yes, that's him. He's been dominating this contest for as long as I can remember." Emma swallowed hard, her nerves heightening. "What if we don't even come close?" John looked down at her, his eyes full of quiet strength. "We'll do our best. That's all we can do." And so they waited. The judges moved from booth to booth, inspecting, making notes, and offering quiet words of approval. As they approached John and Emma's display, Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The judging was formal. Each vegetable was examined for size, color, and overall appearance. The judges whispered among themselves, scribbling on their clipboards. Emma tried to steady her breathing, but it was impossible to ignore the tension building inside her. Then came an unexpected turn. A sudden commotion from the next booth made everyone's heads turn. Mr. Dawkins had a fitful look on his face as he batted at the air, gesturing frantically. "What do you mean my pumpkin isn't good enough? It's perfect. I've been growing it for months." Emma and John exchanged confused glances. What was going on? One of the judges stepped forward and calmly addressed Mr. Dawkins, explaining that his pumpkin had been disqualified due to a small blemish that had been overlooked. The shock was evident in the older man's face. It was as though the world had suddenly turned upside down. His prized pumpkin, the one he had spent so much time nurturing, had failed to meet the criteria. As the commotion settled, Emma felt a surge of both relief and disbelief. The competition had just become that much more intense. They weren't just competing against themselves anymore. They were competing against the unexpected twists of fate. And suddenly, John and Emma had a chance. But it wasn't just the disqualification that made the day even more eventful. Emma's nerves hadn't settled. If anything, they had escalated. She watched the judges as they continued their rounds. Each glance toward their vegetables felt like an eternity. After what seemed like hours, the final moment came. The judges gathered to announce the results. Emma could barely stand still. She gripped John's hand, both of them waiting for the verdict. First place, one of the judges began, goes to John and Emma with their beautifully cared for vegetables. Their attention to detail and care in growing these crops has truly set them apart. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. They had done it. After all the struggles, the doubts, and the setbacks, they had won. She looked at John, her eyes filling with tears. "We did it," she whispered. John smiled, his hand squeezing hers. "We did it." But as they made their way to accept their prize, something caught Emma's attention. The same man who had been disqualified earlier, Mr. Dawkins, was watching them from a distance. His gaze was cold, and for a moment, Emma wondered if there was something more to his disappointment than just a lost competition. But for now, that didn't matter. The prize was theirs, and their victory was bittersweet. As they walked back to their booth, a new chapter began for John and Emma, one filled with new challenges, but also the knowledge that they could face whatever came their way, together. And as the sun dipped low in the sky, Emma and John found themselves at peace, knowing that sometimes it wasn't about the prize. It was about the journey that led them to it. Chapter 9, Grief and Hope. The day after the contest, the farm was still buzzing with excitement. Emma and John had won the coveted first-place prize, but the exhilaration of victory was slowly fading, replaced by an unsettling sense of unease. The joy they had once felt was now overshadowed by the events that had transpired in the days following the contest. As they stood in the middle of their farm, Emma looked at the prize ribbon in her hand, yet it felt strangely hollow. The weight of the prize did little to lift the sadness in her heart. It wasn't the prize itself that had made her feel this way, but what had happened the day before. "John," she said, her voice heavy. "I don't know. It feels like it doesn't mean as much now." John's tired eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was only silence. They had faced so much hardship to get here, but now that they had reached the pinnacle, there was a lingering emptiness. It was the first time they had ever won, yet somehow the victory felt bittersweet. John cleared his throat, looking out across the fields. "Emma, it's not about the prize. It's about the work we've done, and the fact that we've come this far. We've grown. We've learned. But sometimes, there are other things that weigh heavier than ribbons and trophies." Emma nodded, trying to steady her thoughts. It wasn't the competition that was the problem. It was something else. Something more profound had shifted within her. That night, tragedy struck. The evening was unusually quiet, the kind of calm before a storm. As Emma and John walked toward the barn to feed the animals, they heard an odd sound, a soft, muffled whimpering. At first, Emma thought it might be one of the animals in distress, but as they approached the barn, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The door to the shed where their beloved rabbits lived had been left ajar. The latch, usually secure, was broken. Inside, the rabbits were frantic, their cages torn apart, and several had escaped into the wild. Emma's heart sank. She looked at John, whose face had gone pale. They had worked so hard to care for the rabbits, and now they were lost. "What happened?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know. I didn't hear anything, John said, his voice tinged with guilt. "It must have happened while we were at the contest. It wasn't just the rabbits." As they ventured further into the barn, Emma's stomach twisted with horror. The chickens, usually calm and collected, were flapping wildly in their coop. The pigs were restless, their snouts snuffling at the ground in agitation. The animals were unsettled, and Emma could sense that something was terribly wrong. "We need to get them back in their cages. Fast?" Emma said, trying to take control of the situation. But as they tried to corral the animals, Emma noticed something else. A disturbing silence had fallen over the garden. She could feel the weight of it in her chest, the realization creeping up on her as she saw the rows of crops they had so carefully tended to. The vegetables were withered. What had once been vibrant and healthy had now succumbed to something insidious. They had been neglected, left without the proper care they so desperately needed. The freshly picked produce from the contest had been their pride, but now it lay in ruin. "This can't be happening," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. John looked over at her, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Emma, we need to focus. We can fix this, but we need to act fast." They had no choice but to work through the night, trying to salvage what little they could. Their hands were raw and sore from tending to the animals, cleaning up the mess, and desperately trying to restore order to their farm. The damage was extensive. The animals were restless and scared, and the garden was decimated. Emma could feel herself on the brink of breaking. The contest victory seemed so distant now, so insignificant compared to the overwhelming weight of the loss. Everything they had worked for, everything they had hoped for, felt as if it had been stolen away in an instant. But in the midst of the despair, something unexpected began to stir within Emma. As she and John worked side by side, tending to the animals, she found herself reflecting on what truly mattered. The contest, the ribbon. None of that had brought her the sense of fulfillment she had thought it would. What had brought her the most joy was the simple, everyday work, the care they gave to their animals, the way they nurtured life on their farm, and the sense of partnership they shared. "John," Emma said quietly, her voice filled with a newfound resolve, "we can fix this. We can rebuild it. The animals need us now more than ever. And the garden. Well, it'll take time, but we've done it before and we'll do it again." John looked at her, his eyes soft with understanding. "You're right, Emma. This is just a setback. We'll figure it out." And so, with renewed determination, they set to work. The farm needed them, and though it seemed like an impossible task, they had done far harder things together. The work was grueling, and every moment felt like a test of their strength, but the bond between them remained unbroken. In the weeks that followed, they threw themselves into the restoration of the farm. They fixed the barn, rebuilt the cages, and slowly began the long process of restoring the garden. The harvest would be much smaller than they had hoped, but it was something to hold on to. And slowly, the animals settled back into their routines. Their trust was hard-earned, but Emma and John were determined to regain it. One evening, as the sun began to set and the farm quieted down, Emma and John sat together on the porch, taking a moment to rest. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, peaceful even. "I think we're going to be okay," Emma said after a long pause. John smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yeah, I think we will be." And so, though the contest and the prize were distant memories now, they had something even more valuable. Each other, the farm, and the knowledge that no matter what came their way, they could face it together. For as much as life was about the harvest, it was also about the lessons they learned along the way. And in that moment, they knew that despite the hardships, the future was filled with hope. Inspiration had come not in the form of a prize, but in the quiet, steady commitment to life, love, and the land they called home. Chapter 10. A bright victory. After all the trials they had faced, the farm was beginning to feel like a place of hope once more. The hardships that had plagued Emma and John seemed to slowly recede into the past as they found themselves on the other side of the storm. The loss, the tension, the heartbreak, all of it had forged something deeper in their hearts, something unbreakable. As the days passed, They worked tirelessly to restore the farm. Their hands were rough from the constant labor, but their spirits had lifted with each small success. The animals that had once been frantic and unsettled had finally returned to a sense of normalcy. The chickens clucked happily in their coops, the pigs rolled in the mud without a care, and the rabbits, though still skittish, were adjusting to their new enclosures. Even the garden, though not as lush as it had been before the disaster, began to show signs of life. The sunflowers they had planted were beginning to stand tall again, and there was a glimmer of promise in the vegetable patches. "Look at this," Emma said one morning, stepping back from the garden to take it all in. "We're doing it, John. We're rebuilding everything, little by little." John, wiping the sweat from his brow, smiled at her. "It's been a lot of work, but we've made it through. This farm is our heart, Emma, and no matter what happens, we keep it beating." Their days became filled with the same steady rhythm as before. Morning chores, tending to the animals and working on the garden. They took joy in the smallest things, watching the animals frolic in the fields, seeing the first signs of new growth in the soil, and sharing quiet moments over tea in the evenings. There were still challenges ahead, but they faced them together, side by side. And then, just when it seemed like things could finally settle into a peaceful routine, help came from the most unexpected source. One afternoon, as John was repairing a fence near the pasture, a familiar face appeared at the end of the dirt road. It was their neighbor, Peter, a kind man with a heart as big as his farm. Behind him, his children carried baskets filled with fresh produce and homemade bread. "We heard about what happened," Peter said, his face full of concern. "We've been thinking about you too. We know how hard you've worked, and we want to help." Emma's eyes filled with grateful tears as she looked at the bounty of food Peter had brought. "You didn't have to," she said softly, feeling the weight of the gesture. "But we're so thankful. You've always been there for us." Peter smiled warmly. "That's what neighbors are for, Emma. We take care of each other. Besides, you've always been there for us too. I've brought some extra hands to help with the farm work. We'll make sure you don't have to do it all alone." As Peter's children joined in, the work that had once felt overwhelming became a shared effort. Together, they rebuilt parts of the fence, repaired the barn doors, and even helped clear some of the land. What had seemed like an endless mountain of tasks now felt more like a manageable hill. Emma and John marveled at how quickly things were getting done with the extra help. It wasn't just the physical labor that brought them relief. It was the kindness that filled the air. For the first time in weeks, they felt the warmth of community wrapping around them. The isolation they had once felt was now replaced with the comfort of knowing that they weren't alone in the struggle. The farm, which had once seemed like a burden too great to bear, was now a place of shared effort and mutual care. As the days passed, the farm began to bloom once more. The flowers that Emma had so carefully planted for the competition were now in full bloom, their vibrant colors a symbol of the resilience they had found in each other. The vegetables, though they would not yield the record-breaking harvest they had once hoped for, were thriving in their own right. There was a deep satisfaction in seeing the fruits of their labor, no matter how modest. One evening, after a long day of work, Emma and John sat together on the porch, watching the sunset behind the hills. The air was warm and still, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to relax. "You know, I think we've really done it, John," Emma said, her voice soft with contentment. "We've made it through the hardest part. Our farm is back, and so are we." John nodded, his hand gently resting on hers. "We've come a long way, Emma, and we did it together. This farm, these animals, they're a part of us. No matter what happens, we'll always have each other. That's what matters most." They sat in silence, the peaceful hum of the farm around them, knowing that the future held more challenges. But whatever those challenges were, they were ready. They had the strength of their love, the support of their friends and neighbors, and the unbreakable bond they shared with the land. And as the final rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma and John knew that their farm, like their love, would continue to thrive. They had faced the darkness, and now they were witnessing the light of a new beginning. The last scene was simple, but it held all the meaning they needed. Two souls, united in their love for each other, the animals, and the land. In that moment, they knew that, despite all the struggles, they had emerged victorious. Goodness had triumphed, and the farm, their heart and soul, was flourishing once more.